Hello, everyone. My name is Emma, and my presentation is over the article Making Tea, Making Japan, Cultural Nationalism in Practice by Kristen Surrock. Kristen Surrock is an associate professor of politics at the University of London. Her research primarily focuses on international migration, nationalism, culture, and political sociology. Her book, Making Tea, Making Japan, received the Outstanding Book Award from the American Sociological Association's section on Asia. Her work has been published in many prominent academic journals, and basically she has a lot of qualifications, a lot of credentials, various awards, and recognition for her publications. So Sirach's main statement in this chapter is that although tea ceremonies are a defining characteristic of Japan, the nation of Japan had to be built, established, recognized as a nation before it could really be defined by tea and the culture surrounding tea. So, in other words, the creation of Japan's cultural and social norms were built simultaneously with tea practice. And to expand on that, the reason why tea ceremonies are such a prominent aspect of Japanese culture is because they were a consistent part of Japanese society before, during, and after the establishment of Japan as a nation. Surrock explains her argument by providing examples from the past that support her argument. Her argument is based on historical facts and evidence, and chronological examples from three distinct points of time throughout the modernization of Japan. And I'll go more into detail on what these three distinct points of time were and the evolution of tea ceremonies and the impact that tea had on society and culture. So there's several Japanese terms that Surrock used to describe certain aspects of tea ceremonies or Japanese culture in her chapter. And some of them we've learned from this class, but there are several new ones that I wanted to include and explain as well. So the first one is chanoyu, meaning hot water for tea, which we've already learned during this class, but it refers to the traditional tea ceremony where they prepare and serve green tea by mixing matcha powder in hot water. The next term is sencha, which is a type of green tea similar to matcha, but it's prepared differently by infusing the tea leaves in hot water instead of mixing a powder like they do in preparation for matcha. The next term is tsukisha, which was used frequently by Surrock throughout her chapter, and it refers to tea connoisseurs who exclusively practice tea ceremonies because they claim to be connoisseurs and elites. And by practicing tea ceremonies, they proved their status and were qualified to promote tea history. The next two terms go together, and they're karamono and wamono. Karamono means Chinese artifacts, and wamono means Japanese artifacts. These two terms are used to describe artifacts like ceramics, utensils, and other types of historical items from China and Japan. So again, I just wanted to reiterate Surrock's main argument, which is that the tea ceremony did not exist as a staple of Japanese culture before Japan was founded as a nation, because the concept of Japanese culture didn't really exist at that point in time. When tea ceremonies were first introduced to Japan from China, Japan wasn't even called Japan. And as I said earlier, Surrock provides 3 points in time to explain tea ceremonies during the creation of modern Japan. However, before she talks about modern Japan, she first explains pre-modern Japan. And the transition from pre-modern Japan to modern Japan can be explained by two aspects, power and beauty. These two aspects are the biggest reasons for the development of Japanese culture and society. So the first one I want to explain is power. First of all, as we know, tea ceremonies were adopted from Chinese tea practice. And then later in the 15th century, chanoyu became a very popular way to socialize in Japanese society. Tea ceremonies were put into practice by military leaders who had great influence on politics and social status through their interactions with other leaders, commoners, and other people in society. Tea ceremonies were usually practiced among men only because at this time men were in charge of the politics between the state and other countries and territories. Leaders used chanoyu ceremonies as a network opportunity to sit down with leaders from other countries and discuss politics over tea. They even held tea ceremonies as celebrations for military victories. Chanryu at this point in time didn't really have any national connotation because it wasn't like there was a concept of a country to really represent. However, tea practice was a representation of the political power of the state and its power over the people. So overall, it was a privilege to hold tea ceremonies, and only people with the most power had access to the things necessary to host tea ceremonies like wealth, status, etc. The second aspect that led to the creation of modern Japan was the concept of beauty. In the 16th and 17th centuries, tea ceremonies transitioned from a practice or tea ceremonies transitioned from an event that people would hold to a practice because there was more emphasis placed on the skills of the host and the value and beauty of the utensils used. The host of a ceremony was admired for choosing aesthetic items or mixing karamono with wamono or appealing to the wabi aesthetic, which we know is the appreciation of older weathered items. Ceramic utensils were highly valued, and political leaders would even give them out as war prizes. So eventually, as tea ceremonies became more integrated into the lives of the higher social class, there was an emphasis on free mixing, meaning that those who practiced tea would mix and mingle with other people of their same class instead of just practicing tea with like their closest friends or other political leaders. The idea of this was that practicing tea created disciplined leaders and developed social graces, so it was important for members of society to practice Chanoyu. And additionally, artistic practices like ikebana, which is flower arranging, poetry, and especially Chanoyu were promoted and valued for their aesthetics. So there was an aspect of beauty and art that was highly encouraged among society. These two aspects of beauty and power came to be symbols of Japan and its modernity. So now I want to talk about the 3 points of time during Japan's modern history where it became evident that Chanoyu was a huge part of Japan's culture. The first point in time was in the early 19th century when the power shifted from the Tokugawa shogunate to the emperor, and politics, economics, and society completely changed. But one thing that didn't change was the presence of tea and the culture surrounding it. Chanoyu was still practiced, but it was practiced in a different way. And this is where the Tsukisha, the tea connoisseurs, became more prominent. The Tsukisha were people who devoted their lives to tea and tea practice. They had great pride for their society. At this point, Japan was still not a nation, so it was more pride for their people and their society. They held exhibitions to display tea utensils and ceramics used by old warriors and military leaders during the period of time where military leaders were the main practitioners of tea ceremonies. And the utensils that these leaders had used were now part of Japanese national history. So at this point, Japan was beginning to develop and become an established nation. The second point in time took place in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Up to this point in time, tea practice was primarily enjoyed by men. The military leaders, the Tsukisha, and most other enjoyers of tea ceremonies were men because they had access to it. But by the end of the 19th century, it was becoming more and more common for women to enjoy tea ceremonies in their free time. Tea practice became common among all social classes, not just the elite or the connoisseurs. Tea ceremonies became integrated into school teachings as well, because Japanese society and school teachers wanted women to learn tea practice because in their in their eyes it would help develop necessary skills for mothering and leading the household. A man named Fukuzawa Yukichi, who was the founder of Keio University, and he was a scholar and an intellectual, he believed that learning how to practice tea should be made available to all people, no matter their status or financial situation. And he believed the way to do this was to teach it in schools. So there was a curriculum created to teach Chanoyu to students. At this point, the idea of Japan as a nation was beginning to form. Scholars were noticing cultural distinctions between Japan and other countries. And so I think at this point, Japan was more of a nation state, where it was in this in between stage of what it used to be and what it was going to be. The third and final point in time that Surak states was sort of the recognition of tea ceremonies as a national practice was the point where Japanese intellectuals and scholars were noticing that it was a big part of Japanese culture. Intellectual literature and books stated that the cultural and aesthetic meanings behind making tea were essentially Japanese, and that they defined Japan in a unique way. So ultimately, this conclusion really could not have been made without the long and consistent history of tea and Chanoyu throughout the centuries, and the creation of Japan first as a state, then a nation state, and finally an established nation. So I have some thoughts and comments about Surek's chapter. But first of all, I think the detailed history that she goes into of the evolution of tea ceremonies greatly contributes to her argument. I think that the only way to really make this argument is to go into detail on the history and chronology of tea and how it shapes society in the pre-modern and modern eras of Japan. So I think if I were to make the same argument, I would definitely do it in the same way, by providing a chronological timeline of tea practice. But overall, I really enjoyed the chapter. I thought it was really explained well. I didn't feel like there was terminology that was overly confusing. And if something didn't really make sense, Sirach explained the context and the history very well. But the only critique I really feel like I have is that Sirach didn't go into much detail on the artistic side of tea ceremonies, which I don't think it was really her intention to dive deeply into the artistic side. But she did mention that beauty was one of the two main ideas that changed Japan from its pre-modern form to its modern form. So I think it we shouldn't go without mentioning that ceramics definitely had a big impact. Like we've talked about this whole semester, uh, many potters in East Asia, for them, ceramics was just a normal part of life, because people needed utensils and bowls and plates and vessels to hold food items. So it was important that they learn how to make ceramics. But I think what's important to note is that Chanoyu was an art form. It was an opportunity to appreciate the ceramic items and utensils and value them for what they were. And as we know from this class, the process of making a ceramic item really isn't easy. It takes a lot of skill. So I think Chanoyu was a great way to bring artists and potters into the light and give them credit for their creations. Um, and because the aesthetic of tea ceremonies is the reason why tea ceremonies are such a prominent part of Japanese culture, it's important to talk about ceramics, which Surak didn't really do, and I wish he would have done a little bit more. And even when we did the tea ceremony demo, I think it was in February or it might have been in March, I can't remember, but um, it was pointed out that the art on the bowls is really important to the process. Like the beauty of the item is really recognized and emphasized. Like when you're drinking the tea, the art should face away from you to show everyone the art. Um, and so I feel like after taking this class, I feel like I recognize the impact of ceramics, and especially after reading Sirach's chapter, I can now confidently say that I do feel like ceramics impacted tea culture and the prominence of tea culture in Japan.